Yeah, so if the review panel is done grilling Charmin for the moment, this is the time where we would invite members of the audience, both here and on the web, to submit comments or questions. They could be either directed at Donna Logan or members of our science panel.
Oh, come on.
All right, Sam's going to step up.
I don't know if this is on. Sam Snyder, Alaska Conservation Foundation. I guess two questions, and the first is more directed at Don and Charmin. And Don mentioned doing some attitudinal surveys, and Charmin, I think, at least in this context, at least with the charge of the EBD, said, well, we can't ask it around the question of Pebble or a mine in general. But I was curious if there was any, now to Donna, if there was any effort to include the work of the Bristol Bay Regional Vision Project, which, from my understanding, was a pretty robust, community-wide, had broad community buy-in across both sides of the bay, and really sort of got at some of those attitudinal questions, family values, economic concerns, energy, career, education, resource development, and all of that. So I guess
Renewable resource development.
Renewable resource development, I should say. So I was curious if that was, if you intended to include that, and if any of that was referenced. I don't think it was quite finished.
It was
yet.
not completed. That was completed in 2011, I believe. So it was not included in the EBD. But it does get to some of those attitudinal and the social capacity, well-being concerns, visions for the communities. And I think it's a useful document.
And then if I may, one other quick question. And I guess, again, this gets to the next steps and phases, which there's not a clear answer as to sort of what the next phases are. And I guess we can expect that maybe in some time to come after these meetings have finished up. But I think one thing that's particularly with the socioeconomic conversation, and we look at particularly the commercial fishery and the sport fishery, so we'll talk about it a bit tomorrow. Whereas, say, the baseline science conditions, those are, largely fixed in the deposit area. The socioeconomic discussion goes beyond that to the Bristol Bay watershed as a whole. But the commercial fishery and the sport fishery also extend well beyond that, obviously to the chagrin of some, but there are commercial fishermen in Seattle, the Pacific Northwest. There are boat builders in the Pacific Northwest, fly rod manufacturers across the country, around the world that are tied in some perhaps large, medium, or small way to this economy. So I wonder if there will be any attempt to trace some of those broader economic networks that do rely or benefit from the Bristol Bay fishery, and put back into the community at the same time, if there's ways to account for that as well.
Well, I'm not aware of that right now, but it also would be very informative in the whole public discourse on where the benefits are from those industries and how much leakage there is in our economy and such. So I think it's something definitely to think about, but I'm not aware of any plans.
Could I just follow up real quickly on your first question? I think it's incredibly important, that survey you mentioned. If you want to take some questions or sections or even integrate, large parts of it, it's really important to be able to co-vary not just the attitudes, but the attitudes with behavioral measures, such as how much does that household harvest in terms of subsistence resources, or what is the age or the employment or the ethnicity, because that gives you a much better understanding of within the community viewpoints. I guess I'm trying to say that I would reinforce that the attitudinal, however it's constructed, be an integral part of the whole broad questionnaire process, rather than as a standalone effort.
Mill North Environmental Protection Agency. And I just have one quick and probably minor question, but first for the panel and then for Donna. And it's kind of getting back to some points made yesterday in terms of looking at fish and being careful not to look at the short term, because the short term can be a blip in the data and you can't infer anything from the short term. You got to look at the longer term to see what's going on. And I'm wondering about the population data from the villages, and in terms of, I think we saw, how many years did we see?
From 1990.
From 1990. So we saw 20 years of data. I don't know how far back the census goes for each village, but I'm wondering, is that more appropriate to look at a longer term for that, or is 20 years enough time?
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to muddy the situation even more, because I compared the census data to the data that was collected by ADF&G at the same points in time. And for a number of communities, there were really significant differences. And I've already mentioned that I'm vastly suspicious of census data, simply because of their sampling frame and their ability to contact households, where ADF&G are known in the community. They've worked with the IRA, and they go knock on every door. I think the sampling frame for the ADF&G population stuff is much more reliable.
So did you compare ADF&G data that was collected in 2000 with 2000 census data? Is that what you're saying? Or are you looking at 2005 data and comparing that with Department of Labor estimates on population,
yeah.
which is different than census data?
Right. Well, I did both. And sometimes it overlapped in the sense that ADF&G would have a survey in '89, you know, and so forth. But no, I compared it against several different parameters.
No, it's definitely tricky, and making sure that you've got the same time frame works that you're working with, so that you are comparing apples with apples is an important consideration. I know, Don, I know you get it. Yeah, none of this is perfect, you know, none of it's perfect. And so anyway.
And my answer to your question is, it depends upon why you want population data, whether you need a longer time series. And yes, there are a lot of different estimates out there, and there are different trade-offs in, you know, your judgment as an analyst, which data series you use and why. If you want to be able to covary it with other variables in the data set, then you obviously use the Fish and Game survey. If you want a measure that is comparable across time and space, there are a lot of advantages and has a high degree of legitimacy. There's a lot of value to using census data, even though it may not be point accurate in any given year. If you need a data series that has an annual unit, then you have to use the Department of Labor population adjustments. Can you turn that on?
Yeah.
I'm going to show you a, and one of the reasons for using population data is migration is often cited as a good summary measure of quality of life and well-being. If people are moving into a community, you know, it's probably because they want to be there. And this is a population graph developed by Larry Hamilton, and he's doing them for all the places in Alaska. And the bars, the total line is the Department of Labor population, but the vertical bars show net migration on a year-to-year basis. So you can see there's some years where there's a net out migration, and there's some years where there's a net in migration. And you can see some years when there's very little in or out migration, then the natural population increase dominates the trends, you know, births over deaths, what they're shown in the bars at the bottom. And I think that a graph like this has a lot of value in telling a story, because, you know, if you're looking up here in the last several years of the graph, you're going to want to know why people are moving out in those years. And if you compare different communities, you'll see that different communities have different baseline birth rates. And you're going to want to know what's the social significance of one community that has high birth rates versus another community that has low birth rates. So this is a point that I didn't get to in my talk, that having more analysis of the data, more interpretation, more graphical analysis goes a long ways to helping tell a story and gain insight about what's really going on. And I actually thought your presentation did a better job than the baseline document did in showing a storyline by a graphic presentation that provided a comparative framework.
Actually, did those graphics exist in the EBD?
No, we created them for the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, because I couldn't find them.
Yeah.
And,
The data is all found in the
table.
DVD.
Table
Yes,
from-
absolutely.
this is another kind of migration analysis that can be done with the help of the Alaska Department of Labor. This shows migration rates by employment status. And in this case, it was used in the Red Dog Extension Ocaluk EIS. And you'll see that Tech Cominco employees actually have the lowest rates of out-migration from the, I think the unit of analysis, I don't remember now whether it was the Northwest Arctic Borough as a whole or if it was individual communities aggregated together. I'd have to review it for that. And that people who had no employment status had the highest out-migration rates over the years. And people in the private sector had a higher out-migration rate than people who had government jobs.
Yeah, but the control there is if they fly you in from Anchorage, you know, if you really moved.
Well,
If part of the reason this analysis was done was there was the question whether having a Red Dog job and the opportunity to commute from Anchorage motivated people to leave the communities and move their families to Anchorage. And although we heard plenty of anecdotes, statistically we couldn't prove that hypothesis, that there was high enough rates of out-migration for other reasons that you couldn't statistically say that Red Dog employees were any more likely than other groups.
this is really interesting because you hear this as a criticism all the time about the out-migration that happens when you have a big I don't know, North Slope oil or something like that. It's not just mining related. So that's really interesting.
ICER's doing a lot of migration studies, and one of the major reasons that people leave small villages is for education, both for higher education and families who want better schools for their kids. If they can afford to move out, you know, that's a major reason. So maybe, you know, one other potential benefit, if there is the local capacity to capture these benefits, is maybe it can be used to improve schools.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, Steve.
Well, Sharman, I just...
Can you identify yourself first?
Oh, excuse me, Steve Burrell. I was formerly Executive Director of Alaska Miners for 22 years, and I'm an independent consultant now, but that graph was just dynamite. I've never seen that. That's neat. And the interesting thing was this was actually my fourth question, but and I apologize.
How many do you have?
I have 5. And Donna knows I chase questions. I've contracted with her several times. But the real question here was, did you? And first off, I apologize that I wasn't here for the start and the preamble, so I don't know what the rules were that you were given. But have you looked at the recent impacts of the school closures, or are those primarily too new? The school closures of the out-migration is the issue, and I think that's what your graph just showed.
Yeah, the short answer to that is no. Pedro Bay was one of the, in the communities in the Lake Clark, Iliamna Lake area. That school closed after we completed our work on the EBD. But having said that, just the school is central to these communities, and when you close a school, it's devastating. It's devastating for not just for education reasons. It's a community center point, and it's so. Yes, I don't know if there's been that kind of analysis done, but we haven't done that kind of analysis.
Yeah, about 3 or 4 years ago, the mayor for the borough said that he had, I think it was 6 or 7 schools that were within just a few students of losing. Okay, what my first question was really. Did you include, and maybe it's too recent, but have you looked at all the impacts of losing Ted Stevens?
Well, it's a good question. We did look at federal capital projects going into the area and transfer payments, but the broader appreciation and understanding of the impact of losing the chair of the appropriation committee, no, we have not done that. I know ICERs, you guys track the federal monies coming into the state and monitor that. I don't know, well, he's retired now, hasn't he? But
I would have to say from time to time,
yeah,
as resources and funding permit, and I'm not at all sure. It's a great question. Maybe I can find out more by tomorrow at noon.
We work in other communities like Anchorage and so on and so forth, and this is a real concern for our economy here. It's a concern across the state.
It doesn't really affect you, but for Steve, the whole impact of the current economic crisis in this country and what does that mean for federal funding is a separate piece for you guys. Southwest Alaska has what I'd consider an extremely strong tradition of entrepreneurial people. People have their own businesses, i.e. primarily fishing boats and fishing businesses. And have you in any way been able to capture that and how that can affect a project like this? I've been told that there have been people that have been asking the question, well, what kind of services does a large mine need? And I mean, that's from my past. I'd heard that question.
So are you asking like the transferability of skills from a
not so much
or the entrepreneurial
but an attitude,
skills?
An entrepreneurial attitude. Was there any way to try to measure that or look at that?
Well, that again, some survey research, attitudinal research, some analysis of really what is the entrepreneurial nature? What is the I think what is the ability to the success and the ability to start small businesses, and then if it's related to Pebble, then what role those businesses can play.
Yeah. Well, my observation is that probably Southwest Alaska has had greater success in that than maybe any other rural area of the state. It just appears that way. But anyway, that's it. Thanks.
I can address that a little bit. ICER has done studies of entrepreneurship and small business development in rural communities, and we found that fishing communities had higher rates of business licenses per capita than non-fishing communities. And Alaska Native communities, independent without the commercial fishing component, had lower average rates of business licenses than other communities. And anecdotally, the Alaska Native communities that had successful business models were primarily building on their village corporations and using those as incubators for businesses. There are some other very notable success stories of individual Alaska Native entrepreneurs but the Center for Economic Development at the university, it used to be at ICER, it's now independent of ICER, has a website that has this study called The Viability of Business Enterprises in Rural Alaska.
Okay.
And the other thing that we found, we didn't find, we cited other research, that the biggest factor that predicts success of a new small business, as everyone knows, most small businesses go out of business within the first 5 years. But the biggest predictor of success is prior experience in that line of work. And if you grew up in a family that has very little limited work experience, it's hard to get that first step up on the entrepreneurship ladder.
Thanks.
And part of being an entrepreneur is understanding risk. I think fishermen understand that pretty well.
Other questions? Yeah, if you can start by identifying yourself.
Donnie Flegel with Wiedewijk. I was hoping, though, there would have been more detail in the socioeconomic report other than what I've seen in the EBD. And I just want to say that was rather disappointing to me. Another thing is when you look at demographics and you're looking at in-migration, out-migration, I think that we need to know, and we need to look at months. I think we need to look at ages, and I think we need to look at causes. Thank you.
Anybody on the panel or Donna want to respond to that at all?
After you.
I think that, we all want more information, I think. So I don't know how else to respond to that. And then as far as the in-migration, out-migration, and causes, and having a study looking at that similar to what Sharman just showed, I mean, that would be really interesting. I agree.
And specifically to address that issue, I've recently written a paper that uses the 17 communities from the Bristol Bay region, and maybe I'll show a slide or two tomorrow. But the ADF&DG data set allows you to understand how age influences income, education, so forth and so on. That provide you can ask almost any question you want of the data set by using the SPSS files, and they contain a heck of a lot more data. And I'll show you a couple of slides that break up income by ethnicity, by age, by residents in the community, by on and on and on.
I'm interested in seeing that. I can look at my own community, and we're not retaining any of our offspring or our grandchildren. So eventually my own community is going to turn into a retirement community unless there's something of this nature that comes about and draws people back to the land. So there's these transitions. It's also my understanding that subsistence, and I don't know where this would fit in or if it's been looked at, is the more money that an individual makes, the higher that subsistence consumption becomes.
There has been some interesting research done, and probably there's people on the panel that have been involved in that research. But yes, when you have, there's some interesting comparisons that have been done looking at income levels with subsistence success and harvest. And if you have a way to pay for a nicer snow machine that goes further, and fuel, and a new gun, and ammo, and so on and so forth, then you have more tools to be successful in subsistence. And there's been some interesting studies have been done by Fish and Game, I believe, and I think some about UAF as well.
Just, there was an earlier comment by Don about the household being the relevant unit and that it extends beyond the household. So it may be that the higher income supports the group that is going ahead and harvesting it, but not the individual household.
Yes, I think that that's fair.
And
I have seen data that says even the employed individual continues strong ties to the subsistence economy and spends time on the land.
And you know, a lot of some of the mines that that are operating make allowances for people to take time off for subsistence, recognizing that, a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's really important to the communities, it's really important to the individuals, but also for their own ability to keep and retain employees by allowing them to take off and come back and work after they've done their subsistence harvesting. Nothing's more costly to a mine than losing people and then they don't come back, So there's a lot of management plans that have been, drawn up to.
And I'll have a number of slides tomorrow that address this very issue.
The Alaska Department of Labor data set can also be analyzed by age and gender. But
Correct.
It can't be analyzed by age, gender, and employment status at the same time. The cell sizes aren't big enough.
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Abe Williams. I'm the Director of NODA Resources, born and raised in Bristol Bay, 25-year commercial fisherman. Don, you talked a little bit about the relation of subsistence, I guess, and the cash value aspect. Have you looked at, or are you going to look at, or consider the fact that there are some biological issues with some of the caribou herds and moose populations in the area? Most notably, the Alaska Peninsula caribou herd is essentially in a Tier 2 status where there's no subsistence harvest of that particular caribou herd. And I think that if you follow Fish and Game and some of the trends of the moose population as well, those are close behind, if not real close, in relation to those diminished herds. And how that is going to play a substantial issue in outmigration and subsistence consumption in the area and the region as well. And another thing I want to talk about a little bit is, maybe bring to reference is the relation to the commercial fishery and how participation in the commercial fishery is very closely coupled to the fact that you have a job to participate in that commercial fishery. Years ago, during the Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission's participation distribution of permits to the locals in the region, we had a substantial amount of permits in our area, but those have been sold and diminished over the years. And now to buy back into that fishery from a local aspect is very tough without the economic opportunity.
Could I just briefly say that when I was mentioning caribou and moose population before, I was trying to get at exactly the kind of thing that you were talking about there, which is what is the long-term history of those populations and how can we look at the current environmental baseline data for those species in terms of, maybe something even more than a 20-year perspective on what, because caribou population cycles exist on a longer time frame than that, and moose populations have been changing over the course of the last 100 years or so. And so, of course, from my perspective, we'll talk about tomorrow, I prefer, when you're dealing with natural resources alone, to take about a 4,000-year perspective in looking at fluctuations of animal populations and fisheries in relation to human migrations and movements. But that's only been half facetiously. I really think that long-term records of those kinds of things helps to give more meaning to what the current situation is in terms of, particularly some of the terrestrial species as well as the fisheries. So, and I guess, Don, you want to comment on some more of that?
Yeah. Again, I hate to put you off, but I'll show a slide tomorrow that addresses that issue, not for a community in Bristol Bay, but for Kivalina, which has a long time depth, and by long I mean 30 years. I guess ADF&G wasn't out there 1,500 years ago, but and shows the proportion by resource category over time, and how these communities adapt when one particular resource category is low by harvesting more from another. And these same kind of bar charts are available in the EBD. The problem, as you point out, is if land mammals are going down, that means normally you increase your dependence on fish. And what happens if something happens to fish without land mammals to fall back on? And that is a crucial kind of tipping point issue, and one I think that has to be really carefully looked at.
Okay, and so in relation to that, all without migration as well, if you look at the census and follow the censuses over the years, the Bristol Bay Borough has probably sustained a large outmigration in relation to some other communities. If you look at the graph that you showed earlier, Dillingham had some spikes in their population, but this is most certainly in relation to people coming from the communities where it's tougher to not only live because of the high cost of living, but do the things that they need to do to be successful without economic opportunity. And so they move to hub communities like that. King Salmon, for instance, has lost its Air Force base. The Park Service has moved most of their employees into Anchorage or communities like this. And with that, there has been a substantial loss of economic opportunity, and that has created an outmigration in relation to the FAA as well. So, yeah. I mean, that's a very good example of taking away from communities and watching what happens to the population.
Yeah, but a quick reply to that, it's often the case, and migration is really a complex issue, but it's often the case that people move away to obtain employment, but they return, for example, during fishing season, to work with the extended family to bring in the fish. One of the complications that ADF&G has found with climate change, and the variability of the return, warm water, you're not sure when the fish are coming up, it makes it very much more difficult to predict when you will need the labor from urban areas to come back to help you put up the fish, for example. So I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, but it's a really complex issue, but a good one.
Thank you.
Phil North, Environmental Protection Agency, and I had another question that I just remembered, and it's actually for Donna.
Okay.
You looked at the Quechak villages, but you didn't look at the Nushagak villages, and you said that they were the villages that were in closest proximity to the mine site or to the deposit site. And some of those, in some cases that's true, and some others it's really probably not true. But certainly the Nushagak villages are most directly downstream from the deposit site. And so I'm wondering, what was the rationale for Quechak, not Nushagak, and do you have that same kind of data for the Nushagak villages, or are you going to include it?
Well, at this point, I'm not aware of, I don't know what's going on from here on in with regard to the baseline and data and updates and so on and so forth. But the rationale at the time was when we were trying to define and develop a nomenclature, around grouping the communities and what level of communities we were going to do more intense data collection and so on and so forth. I mean, we had discussions about that, and we decided to stick with the kind of the geographic ones with regard to the transportation corridor and other things like that that would, not to say that there aren't other communities outside of that area that are going to, it's important, not important. It's important to gather that information. But it was looking at the transportation and those kind of more direct impacts. And so I think that was thinking of that, having that in mind. But having said that, to provide more detail on any of the other communities that aren't detailed in the report, again, when we selected data to include in the EBD, it's because we knew it was comparable between communities, and and so on and so forth. So it's not tremendously difficult to add another community and level of detail on another community.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, except that you included Levelock and Agiagig and Kakanock, which are not
Yes, I know.
anywhere near the infrastructure
And
or the mine.
I think, well, I'd have to go
Well,
back and
possibly.
think about it and recall, but I think at the time when we were developing the framework for it, those were the communities at the time that were considered, and so we started collecting that information in 2005 and carrying forth.
Okay, and I'm an aquatic ecologist, nothing related to your fields, but in the process of just paying attention to this issue, it does seem like the Nushagak, and this could be completely wrong, and anybody can correct me if they want to, but the Nushagak villages may be more tied to subsistence than the Quechak villages, or at least the upper Quechak villages. I'm not sure if that's true, but
I guess I'd want to defer that question to Steve Braun tomorrow.
okay.
You can see tomorrow.
There you go. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Sort of warn people out for the day. All right, we'll have Todd come up here and wind us down.
Let me hang on to that for a second. Thanks, Milo, for moderating that, and thank the panel members, and particularly thank Donna for all of her hard work in answering questions. So we'll give people a round. So thank you. So we have a full day tomorrow. There's lots of suspense, as Don has alluded to. So I think we're sort of going to wrap up today. We have an optional 7 p.m. Discussion, but it sounds like we've sort of exhausted that discussion. So I don't think we'll do that this evening. So, but we do have as I said, we do have a full day tomorrow. And we'll get started right into this at 8:30, and we will start with cultural resources and recreation, and then in the morning, and then in the afternoon we'll go into subsistence. So, and then that will be the end of the panels. We'll wrap this up. We'll wrap it up tomorrow afternoon with a sort of a check-in with the panel members about their observations and preliminary recommendations, like we did earlier with the Fish and Marine Ecosystems panel. We'll hear some comments from Pebble, and we'll give you sort of a framework for how the Keystone Center is going to proceed to sort of gather all this information together and make some recommendations. So thanks again for all of your input, and we'll see you in the morning.